Hi, I'm Jess Ingleking with Soundings Fine Audio, and today we're going to be talking about everybody's favorite subject, cables. So today's topic of cables, we're going to be discussing the differences in qualities of different speaker wires, interconnect, so RCAs, XLRs, digital cables, and even power cords. Just to get cut to the chase, I think they matter a lot. I would encourage anybody to come into our store and sit down and take a listen for themselves. We're going to talk about how these qualities can affect a system, what their cost is, and how much it can really matter for your system. So with this video, we'll probably get into the weeds a little bit on some of the technicalities. I think it's kind of unavoidable just because there is so much division when it comes to cables. So I'll say this again and again. Test the cables out for yourself. You've got to take the Pepsi challenge. You've got to hear it in your system or in a system that you're familiar with. Just me talking about the technicalities mostly has to do with me talking about that it's not snake oil. There is actual science behind why we choose these wires. Some of this may go over some of our viewers' heads. That's okay. That's what listening tests are for. In the end, I do think that this matters a lot if you're trying to maximize your entire build. When it comes to talking about cables, there are a lot of people who believe that it's just pure snake oil. And I think that's because there are a lot of companies out there that actually do have some good manufacturing and design techniques, but they may not actually be able to back up the full science. There's more to it than just putting a frequency sweep through a wire and seeing what the results are. Things like magnetism, radio frequency interference, those things do matter in the end result of the sound quality that comes out of the whole system. If you have different types of cables from different types of design philosophies mixed together, you'll also get a mixed bag compared to using all of one type of design. We'll discuss those kind of things and see if we can get into the weeds a little bit on those. I want to talk about some of the specific design philosophies of some of the manufacturers we carry. This is not necessarily like a brand spotlight. This is just showing some of the different philosophies that are out there. And there are more than what we'll talk about here. Some companies, for example, focus on solid core wiring, whereas other companies focus on stranded wiring. Now, why would you want that? Well, the idea is that an electrical signal is going to go through the path of least resistance. Well, if you have a stranded connection, then you can basically make sure that it can find its shortest path from the input of the cable to the output. But from a cable designer's standpoint, that may not always be the best thing, because if you twist the cable around, the signal may find a different path on one cable versus another. So that's an argument for solid core wiring. It's consistency. Nordost, for example, lines up all of their solid core wiring in such a way so that no matter how you twist it, you're always going to get that Nordost flavor and the design that they put together. Whereas Analysis Plus, they use stranded wire, and it's woven in a very specific pattern so that they can control the interference and the electrical path that it chooses. Shinyata will actually go for noise reduction. Because of his work for networks and low-level signals and the medical industry, they want to eliminate as much noise as possible. They have special filters that the signal passes through, and that helps reduce some of the spurious noise that sometimes just latches itself into the cable as if it were an antenna. Siltech focuses on lots of different types of metallurgy. So they're not the only one that does this, but their different levels actually go from a high-purity copper to a high-purity silver-gold alloy, all the way up to a very, very pure silver wire that they actually draw in-house. Very expensive to do, but in their mind, that's how they produce the highest results. There are many situations where I would recommend one cable over another. It's very specific to the electronics and to the speaker, and ultimately to the listener's taste. Again, that's why we have all of these options to choose from. We think that all of these cable manufacturers have a lot to offer at different price points. With cables, one of the important things is not everything that we measure is important, and not everything that is important is measurable. I think that's something that kind of separates a lot of the snake oil types cables from some of the manufacturers that we work with. We try really hard to work with companies that have a real measurable sound performance. I'll pick on Analysis Plus, for example. They actually put all of their white page engineering information on their website to show you the science. There are some factors on how the cable itself will affect the sound quality. Some of the big measurables, this isn't all of them, but these are some of the biggest ones that people focus on, are the resistance, the capacitance, and the inductance. If we were talking about crossovers, inductors and capacitors basically affect how the highs roll off compared to how the low frequencies roll off. And your cable can affect these things. Depending on the gauge of the wire, the way that it's wound, how many twists per inch are in there will affect these things. Our ears are very sensitive to timing factors. To illustrate this, all you have to do is take your stereo pair and move one a little closer or move one a little further away, and you'll feel the image shift with that change. That is a timing change. Even small movements our ears will pick up on. So this is a proven thing. If we affect the timing and arrival times of different frequencies within a cable, we can pick up on that as well. Albeit sometimes very subtle, you can hear it. The big debate to me is how much these changes are actually worth. So there are a lot of cables out there that are very, very affordable that can get you really good results. And I think that's why there are a lot of people who say that it doesn't matter, because there are cables out there that cost as much as a house. We have access to power cables that can be as much as $50,000, which sounds ridiculous, but if you have $1 million system, adding a $50,000 wire might start to kind of add up and balancing out the equation. Anybody who's into race cars, when you try to get that last bit of performance, it costs an egregious amount of money to get single percent differences in timing or horsepower. I mean, F1 race cars are disproportionately more expensive than any other type of car on the road, and they're going off tenths of seconds. They spend millions of dollars to get tenth of second improvements. To me, that's the equivalent of what a $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 wire is that's trying to get that last tenth of a second of performance for a race car. We don't need to have that on every system. Likewise, you don't want to put the cheapest tires on your race car. You don't want to put the cheapest cables on your system. So it is about putting things with like and kind. So there are a few things to consider when you're choosing cables for your system. There are different metals that you can use. So you'll find pure copper cables. You'll find pure silver cables. You'll find combinations thereof. We even have cables that are silver gold alloys, copper gold alloys. Those things will make a big difference in the tonality, again, relative to the price of the system. There are engineering papers out there that actually show that the metal makes a difference in what frequencies will travel best. So we know that silver and gold are some of the best electrical conductors. That's why so many circuit boards use silver and gold solder at the highest levels. But we use copper a lot of times for the practical reason of it's cheaper. A solid silver wire costs a ridiculous amount of money. And then when we talk about the purity of that, it's like having potholes in a road. If you have less purity, it's like a not so smooth road you're driving down. High purity cables are like a super smooth path for the signal to travel down. We know that high frequency signals tend to travel better on silver than on copper, whereas a mid-frequency signal will travel just fine. And so if we have any kind of discrepancy, this brings us back to that topic of timing and what our ears are sensitive to. So that's why companies will play with these different metals. And again, you can decide whether those differences are worth what they're asking dollar-wise, but I think that objectively there are differences in the sound. So we have some companies that will take a solid copper core and then plate it in silver or plate it in gold to achieve their particular resonant qualities or their particular flavor of sound that they believe to be the holy grail of sound. Some companies, you want to control your controllables. If you start twisting a wire, it will affect the way that the magnetism propagates. So in a power cord in particular, or in a high-powered system where lots of watts are running through, if you actually have a magnetics lab, you can actually show how that magnetism changes. And that affects the frequency response, albeit at a minute level. There are also instances where the cables can couple with each other. So if you have a simple system with one wire, it may not be as susceptible to interference as if you have a whole rat's nest full of cables that are all next to each other. They will have micro interferences that add up to changes in the frequency response overall. So if we dive into some of the different types of cables that you could use in the system, we can talk about why you would look for certain characteristics in a given wire. So speaker cable's a real easy one. There is a relationship between how thick the wire is and how easily extra power will flow, particularly over a distance. So at the 6 to maybe even 10 foot range that most people have their stereo system at, as far as distance from the amplifier to the speaker, there is a diminishing return big time on speaker gauge. So a 14 gauge wire can actually accomplish quite a bit. That's not to say that you won't get more from an 8 gauge wire, but that's relative to wattage. I won't get into the math specifically, but there are different returns on that value. It's actually a logarithmic function. So every time you double the gauge of wire, you are not getting double the benefit. So we have to weigh out how loud you're going to play, how much wattage is going through, and the length of speaker cable. But again, between 14 gauge, 10 gauge, that's going to be a very good kind of roundabout place to stick to. Going to a 4 gauge power cable that you'd see in like car audio, not necessary for the majority of applications. If we go into interconnects carry a smaller signal. So because of that lack of return on going to a thick wire, you'll usually see a thinner cable itself. They're usually back behind the equipment. They're usually closer to the power source. So they are going to be susceptible to a different type of interference, being that the signal is so much smaller than the giant signal that could be going through a speaker cable. You can have different qualities of connectors as well. The connector is where the signal that's in the wire transitions to the connector itself. It's like a big speed bump. There are measurable differences in these connectors. If you've ever read anything about eddy currents, there are these extra waves that happen from noise and echoes that will bounce back and forth within the cable and within the connector. That's one of the things that causes a lot of price changes in wire. The connectors themselves are often machined out of very high quality, high purity, rare metals. That drives up the cost a lot. So when you see a cable go from as much as $500 to $5,000, you'd be amazed at how much of that cost is actually in that connector itself. Digital cables have a different problem. The digital world needs to have a situation where they pass a square wave of on or off. That's the 1 and 0. But in reality, it takes time for that voltage to go into the cable, and you won't have this perfect square wave. Part of the reason that happens is the impedance of the cable. Your standard digital connection is what's called a 75 ohm connector. If it's a balanced cable, it would be 110 ohms. If we deviate higher or lower than those numbers, that will affect the high frequencies or the low frequencies depending on how it actually connects. Some of the companies we deal with will only use certain types of connectors on their digital wire because it's the only way they can guarantee a 75 ohm connection, for instance. It's that important. So when you're spending money on a digital cable, that's what you're doing, is you're preventing the jitter that's actually caused by the cable itself. These are measurable differences. I think that, again, I'll say this a lot, it's a diminishing return depending on your system. If you have a $50 DAC you got off Amazon, it may not make sense to buy a $1,000 digital cable. Whereas if you have a $100,000 specialized DAC, you're 100% going to hear the difference. There are also differences between digital coax, BNC, and Toslink, or fiber optic. The fiber optic connection was designed to be a mass-produced cable that could be easily plugged in, but the quality of the fiber itself, the polished end, whether that light actually goes in or out of focus, and then just the secure nature or lack of security on some of those cables will affect how well that light is perceived and how well it focuses into your source. Again, it's all about what your system needs. When it comes to power cords are an interesting one. Power cords are actually where I recommend most people start their cable journey. If you want to get the most value out of upgrading your cable loom, power cords, I think, are the way to go. Power cords, I also believe, are the least understood. We work with a company called Siltech, and Siltech has a very interesting story. When Philips Consumer Electronics left the consumer industry in Europe, Siltech was actually able to purchase their lab. That's a big deal because that was actually one of the most sophisticated electronics labs in the world, particularly at the time. They actually model the magnetic field that the power cords put out, and they have been able to empirically determine that that is one of the main factors for improving electrical signal. If you run a current through a wire, it produces a magnetic field, and magnetic fields are difficult to control. So if you have another cable that is also passing a current, those magnetic fields will attract each other just like two magnets would. So they go to great lengths to make sure that those fields are much smaller so that you have less interaction, particularly with the giant power supply inside many amplifiers. The amplifier is going to be pulsing with the music and creating a magnetic field that grows and shrinks, and that actually has an effect that couples with the power cord itself. This is the basis for why, in Siltech's case in particular, why they believe that they are improving the sound quality. I think this is a very obvious difference. Again, come in here, you're welcome to sit down in our chair and take the Pepsi challenge and listen to it for yourself, and you can determine if you actually hear anything. Many other power cords have different methods of achieving this result, but this is where power cord performance starts. So heavy gauge with proper shielding and being able to control that magnetic field, that's a big deal. The newest horizon for hi-fi cables is actually network cables. And I have to admit, I was highly skeptical on network cables just because of the way networking functions as a design, as a system. But it's been, just like all these other wires, it is something that I have experienced personally and have found really, really good. It's a good place to get some extra performance in your system. We know that, for example, one of the differences between a standard Cat5 cable and a Cat6 cable is how tightly the twisted pairs are twisted. If there is any kind of looseness there, then the data actually doesn't pass the same. So this is one of the bases for why you would want to upgrade some of these network cables. There's a consistency there. If you have 10 of these high performance cables in a row, they're going to sound like each other versus the one that came free in the box. It just came off a spool. Who knows how it was terminated? They didn't put as much love and care into the connectors, which we already stressed the importance of that. This is no different. These are small, tiny signals. It does not take much to flip a 1 to a 0 and a 0 to a 1. The error correction in there has no idea what the music is supposed to sound like, so it's very important that the signal is maintained from input to output. One of the cable manufacturers we work with is Shinyata. Shinyata actually, the owner of Shinyata, helped to design gigabit networks as we know it. So they know a thing or two about networking and networking cables. He was actually able to develop a line of wires that can address some of the things that are audio specific. It's not about speed in a network cable, it's about bandwidth. We have companies, actually virtually all the cable companies we work with, they don't guarantee the gigabit speed in some of their models, but they guarantee bandwidth specifically for an audio application. In your other type of data worries where you're passing along just packets of whatever, there seems to be a difference in this frequency range that audio tends to land in. So when do you upgrade? I would say just don't use the stuff that comes in the box. If you want to use a more affordable cable that people online seem to like, go for it. The main thing is just don't use the cheap stuff that comes in the box. All of these manufacturers, electronics manufacturers that we talk to, they all acknowledge that cables make a difference. So why don't they put high quality ones in there? Well, they're not trying to endorse any particular brand. They want the end user to experiment and use what their ear tells them is the right way to go. Some companies put better stuff in the box than normal, but most of them are these cheap, very highly mass-produced models that don't do their equipment any justice. One of the big things that I recommend to anybody who wants to try out cables is once you find a cable that you can hear the difference and you appreciate that sound difference, use that philosophy for everything. All of the power cords in the system, the interconnect, the speaker cables, the network cable if you're so inclined. Having it all designed with the same philosophy, I feel, is where you really get your big lift in performance. When you start mixing and matching cables, you get an unpredictable recipe. It's my belief that that's where a lot of the lack of understanding in cable sound comes from. I would generally rather see somebody replace their entire loom with one low-level set of cables than go for one super cable. It's not the case where you're going to have one cable that's going to elevate the entire system. Just like with speakers or electronics, if you have one item that is dramatically out of sync with everything else, it kind of shines a light on everything that doesn't match. So matching is a really, really big deal. Again, trying this stuff out in your home, on your system, not just in our systems, is something that we offer. If you reach out to us, we're happy to do in-home demos. Sometimes when you're in the store, it can be very difficult to tell how much of a change was actually there. But when it's on your system that you're familiar with, you'll know right away. So we usually will bring out a couple different varieties of cable, or we will make a recommendation. We'll go through a couple different models, and generally we'll get to a point where you might be able to hear the sound difference, but maybe it's not worth it dollar-wise anymore. And that's where you should stop. Don't get crazy. I don't think everybody needs to spend $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 on cable loom. I mean, it's really kind of hard to justify unless your system is at a certain level. The main thing is just to get a cable that is as well designed as the rest of the equipment in your system. All right, so to wrap everything up, I would say just do your best to audition cables in your system. Find something that you like. Don't take a reviewer's word for it. Don't take someone else's word for it. Try it out for yourself. There are situations where a cable may not stack up to your expectations. That's okay. Don't buy that cable. We have multiple types of cables at Soundings for the same reason we have multiple types of speakers. Not every speaker is for every situation and every person. Same thing goes with cables. Try them out. Pick something that works for your budget and try to fill out your entire system with that level of wire. Again, it has to make sense for you. I would love to hear about other people's experiences that they've had with cables. I know that there's a lot of double-blind listening going on in our industry. We do the same thing at our store. We don't just bring in anything just because it's the hot topic. The cables we have, we really feel make a difference, and so we want to hear about your experiences as well. As always, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe, and we have more videos on the way.